The summer of 1874 arrived in Ellis County, Kansas, the way most summers did on the high plains, hot, dry, and full of a farmer's cautious optimism. Ruth Callahan had put in 11 acres of wheat and corn that spring, working the ground herself since her husband Thomas had died of typhoid the previous winter, and by early July the wheat stood tall enough that she'd allowed herself, for the first time in months, to imagine a harvest that might actually carry her and her son through the coming year. She did not know, as she walked her rows that second week of July, that the optimism of an entire region was about to end within the space of 3 days. It began, as her neighbors later described it, as a strange darkening at the edge of the sky. Not storm clouds, but something that moved with a low humming drone, a sound that grew louder as it approached, until it filled the air completely. Ruth's son, Daniel, 8 years old, was the one who first understood what he was looking at. "Grasshoppers, Mama," he said, and there was something in his voice that already knew this was not the kind of grasshopper trouble a garden fence could solve. What descended on Ellis County that week was not, strictly speaking, an ordinary infestation. It was a swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts, a now extinct species that once formed during the 1870s, some of the largest insect swarms ever documented on the North American continent. A single swarm recorded the same summer Ruth watched her fields disappear was later estimated by entomologists to have covered an area larger than the state of California, and to have contained more individual insects than any animal aggregation in recorded human history, a scale so difficult to comprehend that even the farmers who lived through it struggled to describe it accurately to relatives back east. The locusts did not merely eat the wheat and corn. They ate the leaves off trees, the wool off the backs of sheep left too long in open pasture, the wooden handles of tools left outside, and the curtains hanging in open windows. They ate anything with organic fiber they could reach, stripping Ruth's 11 acres down to bare stalks within a single afternoon. And by the second morning there was nothing left standing that resembled a harvest. Ruth stood at the edge of what had been her wheat field and understood, with the flat clarity that comes after a shock has passed and a fact has simply become true, that she had no crop, no income, and, within a matter of weeks, once what remained in her pantry ran out. No reliable way to feed her son through the winter. She was not alone in this. Contemporary estimates from the summer of 1874 suggest the locust plague affected agricultural land across a corridor stretching from the Dakota Territory down through Texas, with Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri among the hardest hit. County relief committees formed within weeks in many affected areas. State legislatures debated emergency aid, and in the following year the federal government authorized surplus army rations to be distributed to destitute settler families. One of the earliest instances of organized federal disaster relief for an agricultural crisis in American history, though the aid was often slow, uneven, and insufficient for the scale of the loss. What made the crisis particularly bitter for families like Ruth's was the specific vulnerability of crop farming to an event like this, compared to other kinds of agricultural work practiced in the same region. A wheat or corn farmer's entire year of labor existed at any given moment as a single vulnerable asset standing in the ground. One event, whether drought, hail, fire, or a locust swarm, could erase an entire season's income in an afternoon. Cattle ranching, which depended on grazing land rather than planted crops, was not immune to hardship, but it was structured differently. A herd represented accumulated value, built over years rather than months, spread across many individual animals, rather than concentrated in a single field, and grass, while it too suffered locust damage, tended to recover faster than a stripped wheat stalk, which simply would not regrow before the season ended. This structural difference is, in plain terms, why a rancher in the same county might come through the summer of 1874 shaken and short on hay, while a crop farmer's household came through it with literally nothing left to sell, eat, or plant. Elias Vance ran cattle on a spread, 8 miles west of Ruth's homestead, land he'd built up over 12 years since arriving in Kansas as a younger man with almost nothing. He'd lost pasture grass to the locusts, same as everyone, and 2 of his hired hands had left within the week to try their luck further east. But his herd was intact, his root cellar was stocked from the previous year, and his well still ran clean. He was, by the narrow accounting of that particular disaster, one of the fortunate ones. Ruth walked the 8 miles to his gate on the 9th day after the swarm passed, with Daniel beside her and a decision already made, because the alternative to making it had become unthinkable. She had heard, from a neighbor who'd heard it from another neighbor, that Vance was still hiring, that he needed hands to help salvage what pasture remained and repair fence line. The locusts had stripped bare, since even a wooden fence rail with old paint on it had proven edible to a hungry enough swarm. She found him at the barn and did not waste time on a preamble. She did not have the composure to deliver gracefully. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I can work. I've farmed 11 acres alone since my husband passed. And I can do fence work, stock work, whatever needs doing. I'm not asking for charity. I'll sleep in the barn if that's what's proper. I only need enough to feed my son." Elias Vance looked at her for a long moment, and then at Daniel, who stood, very straight beside his mother, in the particular way children stand when they have decided that looking strong is the only thing currently within their control. "You'll sleep under my roof," Vance said, "not the barn. I've got a spare room's gone unused since my sister moved to Topeka, and a boy oughtn't sleep on straw when there's a bed going empty 20 feet away. As for work, if you can do fence and stock, I'll take the help and pay you a fair wage for it, same as I'd pay any hand. But the room isn't part of the wage. That's just what a roof is for." It's worth pausing on why Vance's answer mattered as much as it did, beyond simple kindness. Ruth had offered a specific, narrow trade: labor in exchange for her son's food with the barn as her own accommodation. Because that was the trade she believed she had the right to ask for. Frontier communities of the 1870s operated on a fairly rigid understanding of reciprocity. Charity, unearned and unbalanced, carried a social weight that many proud, self-sufficient settlers actively refused, even at real cost to their own survival. Ruth's insistence on sleeping in the barn wasn't modesty for its own sake. It was an attempt to keep the arrangement inside the boundaries of a transaction she could accept, without it costing her the last thing the locust swarm hadn't taken from her, which was her sense of standing on her own feet. Vance's response worked precisely because it didn't argue with that instinct. He didn't offer her charity. He offered her a job, at a fair wage, which she could accept without compromise. The room was a separate matter entirely, framed not as generosity requiring gratitude, but as an ordinary fact about how a roof functioned, which allowed Ruth to accept it without the exchange becoming one she couldn't live with. The work that followed was real, and it was hard. Fence lines needed rebuilding across pasture that stretched for miles. Posts needed resetting where locusts had weakened the wood enough for wind to snap them, and the surviving cattle needed moving to whatever grass remained ungrazed by the swarm. Ruth worked alongside Vance's one remaining hired hand, a quiet older man named Silas Pruitt, who'd survived 3 previous grasshopper years in his decades on the plains and taught her over the following weeks the particular signs that told an experienced rancher when a swarm might be building on the horizon days before it arrived. A stillness in the birds, an unusual quiet from insects that normally sang at dusk, a certain metallic color, low in the western sky that old-timers had learned, through hard repetition, to read as warning rather than weather. Daniel, for his part, took to ranch life with the specific enthusiasm boys of 8 years old bring to any work that lets them feel useful among adults who treat them as capable. He learned to check water troughs, to spot a fence post that had gone soft at the base before it failed, and to sit quiet and still beside Silas while the older man explained, patiently and without condescension, why a longhorn steer moved differently than a dairy cow, and what that difference meant for handling one safely. By September, the worst of the locust swarms had moved on, following whatever pattern of wind and instinct drove them across the continent that particular year. And what remained of the region's crop farms stood empty and stripped, waiting for a harvest that would not come. Many families in Ellis County did not stay through the winter. The exodus of settlers abandoning claims across the locust-affected plains states in late 1874 was significant enough that some counties saw population declines that took years to recover from. Ruth stayed. The wages from ranch work, modest but steady, carried her and Daniel through a winter that would otherwise have broken them, and by spring she had saved enough, alongside what Vance offered as a fair arrangement for continued work, to consider whether rebuilding her own 11 acres made sense at all, or whether the more sensible path forward looked like the one she was already walking. She and Elias Vance did not marry that year, nor the year after. Theirs was not a story that moved quickly. In a household that had learned the hard way what it cost to make an arrangement, neither party could stand behind honestly. But the working partnership between Ruth's labor and Vance's land held through 2 more difficult seasons, through a drought year and a hard winter that took cattle across the county, and by the time the arrangement between them changed into something neither of them had originally set out to build, it had been tested by enough real hardship that neither needed convincing it would hold. Daniel grew up largely on that ranch under Silas Pruitt's patient instruction and Elias Vance's steady example, in a household built not on a single dramatic rescue, but on a fair wage, an honest room, and years of 2 people choosing, repeatedly, to keep showing up for each other's hardest days. The Rocky Mountain locust that darkened the sky over Ellis County that July no longer exists. The species declined sharply in the decades following the 1870s plagues and was declared extinct by the early 20th century, likely due to the plowing and irrigation of the river valley, breeding grounds its population depended on. An ordinary, unremarkable fact about how a landscape's transformation can end even the most overwhelming natural force, not through any single victory, but through years of settlement changing the ground the swarm was born from. What Ruth Callahan carried forward from that summer wasn't really about the insects at all, though she never forgot the sound of them. It was the plain lesson written into every account of that plague that survives in county records and old letters, that the difference between ruin and recovery on the frontier rarely came down to who worked hardest, since everyone worked as hard as they were able. It came down, more often, to who still had something standing when the worst had passed, and to whether, when they didn't, someone nearby was willing to offer a fair wage and an honest roof instead of either turning away or offering charity that couldn't be accepted without cost. Elias Vance never described what he did that July as anything remarkable. He'd simply had a full root cellar in a summer when so many people didn't, and to his mind, the only sensible thing to do with that was put it to use.